Chapter 5, The Evolution, Discrepancies between their early and later logic. Plato is often read as if he wrote one consistent system from first to last, a single mind marching in a straight line toward the reliable knowledge of the form of the good. The reality, as any careful reader of the dialogues discovers, is more intricate. The younger Plato, the Socratic interlocutor who probes definitions with irony, lentus, and the patient insistence on clear terms, seems to work within a realm of practical inquiry, virtue, courage, piety, justice. The older Plato, the philosopher who writes treatises, who stages debates about the nature of being, the structure of reality, and the cosmos itself, shifts toward a more ambitious metaphysical taxonomy, a stratified ascent from opinion to knowledge, from plausible demonstrations to necessary truths. Between these portraits lie tensions that can be described as discrepancies between their early and later logic. They are not simply errors or contradictions, they reveal a maturation of method, a recalibration of aims, and a widening of context. This chapter traces that evolution and considers what the apparent discrepancies reveal about the project Plato undertakes in his mature phase. 1. The early logic, questions, definitions, and the elentus. The early phase of Plato's writing is dominated by the Socratic method as a practical instrument for moral and civic understanding. In the Euthyphro, Socrates engages in an examination of piety, not to rattle off a fixed theory but to demonstrate that a stable, universal definition of piety eludes easy capture. The dialogue teaches a method. If one cannot produce a definition that can withstand critical testing, one has not yet arrived at knowledge, at least not at the level Socrates seeks. The emphasis is definitional rigor, conceptual clarity, and the belief that virtue has a rational, perhaps teachable core. Yet the method remains provisional, the moral consequences of the inquiry emerge, but definitive doctrine is elusive. In the Apology, Socrates presents a profile of knowledge distinct from mere cleverness. He claims to know what he does not know, his own ignorance. This contrarian stance is not a retreat from knowledge but a disciplined epistemic posture. He refuses to furnish others with myths of certainty unless they survive the test of cross-examination. The elentus, refuting a claim by showing its inconsistencies or by exposing the inadequacy of its definitions, serves as a methodological tool, not only to adjudicate disputes but to unveil the limits of conventional wisdom. The aim is not to present a settled metaphysical system but to cultivate a way of thinking that resists confident illusion. In the Meno, the early approach to knowledge and virtue becomes a touchstone for the question of cognitive ascent. The paradox of inquiry, how do we inquire about what we do not know, is presented, and the solution offered, recollection or anamnesis, returns the learner to an inward treasure house of knowledge that the soul has carried from prior lives. Here, we glimpse an embryonic form of the later theory of the soul's immaterial nature and its acquaintance with universals. Yet even this is framed as a human-scale problem: can virtue be taught? The dialogue moves toward practical implications, education, guidance, and civic virtue, but the form of its argument remains tethered to the Socratic tactic: draw out the definitional core through cross-examination and draw attention to the absence of a secure, general answer. In the early Theaetetus, often dated to a time around the mid-career of Plato but still relatively early in tone, knowledge is debated as justified true belief, and the attempt to secure a robust definition of knowledge collapses into a crisis of the very criteria by which we claim to know. The chapter ends with suspicion about the possibility of any absolute account of knowledge that would survive skeptical challenge. In short, the early logic is primarily methodological. It asks for precise definition, seeks to outweigh competing views through questions, and treats knowledge as something to be proven, not merely assumed. The early dialogues therefore present a kind of epistemic discipline, an insistence on rigorous scrutiny and an aversion to easy certainty. What marks this early moment most clearly is not a tiny, fixed theory but a method. The method is dialectical in spirit, skeptical about confident pronouncements, and oriented toward moral clarity. It treats virtue, justice, courage, and piety as respectable objects of inquiry, but its success is not measured by the installation of a metaphysical system. It is measured by the rigor and resilience of the inquiry itself, the capacity to press interlocutors toward more precise formulations, and the willingness to let the argument rest in aporia, an aporia that invites further philosophical activity rather than one that yields immediate, canonical answers. 2. The later logic, assent to the forms, systematic metaphysics, and the unity of knowledge. If the early dialogues model a solar, practical inquiry into moral definitions, the later works present a cosmos organized around the form of the good and a robust metaphysical architecture. The Republic inaugurates a new scale of ambition, not only to define virtue but to explain the nature of reality and the conditions by which human beings can participate in it. The ascent, then, is from opinion, doxa, to knowledge, episteme, through a structured exposure to the intelligible realm. The Republic's famous lineaments, the divided line, the ascent of the philosopher, the four cardinal virtues, and the philosopher king, signal a move away from the purely practical to the essential. The philosopher's job is not simply to define virtue for a city but to govern knowledge itself, to ensure that political life reflects the true order of reality, as apprehended by reasoning about the forms. Central to the later logic is the theory of the forms, eternal, immutable, non-physical archetypes that give intelligibility to the changing, sensible world. The forms supply the ultimate causes of both being and value. The form of the good, in particular, functions as the source of intelligibility and as the telos of the ascent. Objects participate in the forms, knowledge of any object presupposes knowledge of its form. This is a radical shift from the early emphasis on definitions and on the ethical psychology of virtue. The later logic treats ethical and political questions as nested within a grand metaphysical framework in which the nature of reality itself, its necessity and intelligibility, can be grasped through disciplined dialectic and rational assent. The Parmenides, the Sophist, and the Theaetetus later dialogues dramatize this shift in more technical terms. The Parmenide stages a severe examination of the one and the many, the problem of participation, and the difficulties in conceiving forms as separate yet somehow related to sensible objects. The Sophist presses on the ontological status of being and non-being, forcing a more careful account of how we talk about things that appear to be and those that truly are. The Theaetetus, however, still lingers near the question of knowledge as true belief with justification, suggesting that the search for a secure, precise theory of knowledge is an ongoing labor, not a finished product. Yet by the time we reach the middle and late works, especially the Republic, the Timaeus, the Philebus, and the Laws, the tone has largely accepted the project of building a coherent metaphysical and epistemological system, even if substantial questions still remained about how best to articulate it. In these later works, logic becomes the tool for defending a comprehensive, structured account of reality. The dialogue form is no longer primarily the Socratic cross-examination aimed at exposing errors in common belief, it becomes a forum for constructing arguments that require consistent, interlocking principles. The method of ascent through the levels of knowledge, from images to mathematical objects to the true forms, corresponds to a kind of logical progression that presupposes certain claims about the nature of reason, the possibility of certain knowledge, and the necessity of a rational order to the cosmos. The result is a more systematic, almost mathematical, logic in which each part of the argument depends on a more distant, more universal premise, culminating in the good as the supreme cause of all intelligible order. 3. The discrepancies, where early methods meet late ambitions. The apparent discrepancies between early and late logic in Plato's corpus arise from differences in aims, scope, and epistemic aspirations rather than from mere contradiction. Several tensions stand out. First, there is the tension between the humble, performative dialectic of the early dialogues and the confident, system-building metaphysics of the later ones. In the early works, argument is a tool for clarifying moral life. It is not primarily a demonstration of necessity or an exposition of a fixed ontology. Even when knowledge is discussed, it is often framed as something fragile, true belief that can be corrected by a better argument or recollective knowledge accessed through dialectical prompting. In the later works, by contrast, the structure is designed to deliver a demonstration of reality's order, a justification of the forms as the ultimate objects of knowledge, and a political theory that rests on the acceptance of a metaphysical hierarchy. The early method is episodic, dialogical, and, at least at surface level, adaptive to the interlocutor's questions. The later method is systematic, hierarchical, and universal in ambition. Second, the status of definition and universals shifts. In the early dialogues, definitions are provisional, tested against intuitive plausibility, and often revised or rejected under scrutiny. The aim is to illuminate the virtue in human conduct by clarifying terms. In the later dialogues, definitions themselves are subordinated to ontological commitments. The forms themselves supply the objective standards by which definitions are measured. The term, virtue, in the late view, is anchored in the form of the good and then investigated through its participation in the perfectly known. The move from pragmatic definition to ontological commitment is not merely a change in topic, it is a radical transformation of what counts as legitimate knowledge. Third, the early dialogues are skeptical about confident claims. Socrates professes ignorance, discloses his own lack of knowledge, and treats moral claims with a wary eye for consistency. The later works, while not devoid of critical inquiry, adopt a posture that treats certain knowledge as attainable through the ascent to the forms. The shift can feel like a loss of epistemic humility, even if one accepts that the later texts are addressing a different domain of inquiry. Some readers have argued that the early and late phases represent two different projects, one concerned with ethical life as a craft of virtue, the other concerned with metaphysical systems that yield objective truths about being and value. Others argue that the two projects are compatible when read as stages of a continuous method that begins with practical inquiry and ends in rigorous dialectic about the nature of reality. Fourth, representational stance toward the sensible world diverges. The early Plato takes the Socratic question as central: what is X? Then, once a form of X is identified, one can cultivate the corresponding virtue in civic life. The late Plato affirms that the sensible world is a mirror or an image of a higher, intelligible order. This is not simply a change of subject, it is a reorientation of epistemic priority. The early dialogues often seem to treat visible particulars as brief, instructive exemplars that lead the mind toward definitions that capture generalizable truths. The later dialogues treat the sensible as epistemically secondary to the intelligible, a world whose structure can only be grasped by reasoned assent. Fifth, there is a methodological shift from a concern with persuasion and moral psychology to a concern with demonstration and formal argument. In the early stage, the desirability of persuasion, getting the other person to see the truth through effective questioning, remains a staple of the dialogue. In the later stage, the emphasis shifts toward a demonstration-like precision. Premises must logically entail conclusions, and the argumentative chain must be coherent with the overarching metaphysical framework. The late works demand more stringent internal coherence and resist the circularities and ambiguities that might pass for plausible moral psychology in the early stage. 6. Concrete contrasts, case studies that illuminate the evolution. Examining specific dialogues helps crystallize the point. Consider Euthyphro and Republic side by side. In Euthyphro, the question is a straightforward definitional one: what is piety? The dialogue presses for a definition that can be applied across cases, but the definition remains provisional, and Socrates often leaves the interlocutor with a sense of its insufficiency. In the Republic, the question expands in scale: what is justice, not just in one case but in the order of the city and the human soul? The search for the form of the good becomes a methodological centerpiece. The difference is not only one of scale, it is one of purpose. Euthyphro seeks a robust form of a virtue as an ethical guideline. Republic seeks the very basis of an actualized order in which virtue and knowledge are harmonized through the good. Meno offers a vivid microcosm of the evolution. It begins by entertaining the paradox of inquiry and ends with recollection as a method of epistemic access. The moral impulse is still central, but the method points toward a more durable theory that virtue is knowledge, or at least that knowledge of virtue is possible, even if the contemporary student cannot yet demonstrate it. The later dialogues present a more radical thesis. Virtue may be the knowledge of the form of the good, a knowledge that grounds political life and personal action. The leap, from virtue as teachable or discursive, toward virtue as a kind of knowledge of the ultimate cause, illustrates a shift in epistemic ambition. Parmenides and Theaetetus dramatize the continuity and the difficulty of the ascent. The Theaetetus questions the very possibility of knowledge in terms of justification. The Parmenides, by presenting a rigorous challenge about the one and the many, invites a reassessment of the sources of knowledge and the status of forms in relation to sensible existence. These are not merely skeptical detours, they are structural tests of the late Platonic program. If the forms exist, how do we know them? How do they relate to the many that we perceive? The late dialogues acknowledge the need for a disciplined, systematic approach to such questions, while recognizing the stubborn complications that accompany any robust metaphysical system. Finally, the laws, the late, more regulatory dialogue, shifts the focus from philosophical assent to political prudence. Here, the method is less about the dramatic exchange of questions and more about the construction of a feasible and stable social order. The laws preserve the essential conviction that philosophy must be connected to daily life and civic governance, but they do so with a tempered, almost realist pragmatism. The shift here is not a retreat from metaphysical speculation, it is an acknowledgement that political life demands practical methods, institutions, and laws, structures that must be intelligible within a comprehensive theory but need not depend on the most radical metaphysical commitments. The discontinuity here, between a philosopher king who understands the good and a legal framework that enforces stability, again marks a crucial moment in the evolution of Plato's logic from inquiry to organized governance. 7. Why the evolution matters, readings, criticisms, and a unified picture. The apparent discrepancies do not simply complicate a single narrative about Plato's thought, they illuminate the deeper aim of his philosophical project. Plato's later logic can be understood as an attempt to ground ethical and political life in a metaphysical order that transcends the contingencies of opinion. The early dialogues, by contrast, emphasize the fragility and provisional status of our beliefs when pressed by rational scrutiny. Taken together, they present a cycle of education, from the partial, fallible, question-driven exposition of the soul's moral concerns to the comprehensive, systematized account of reality that demands loyalty to a rationally grounded theory. Scholars have offered various readings to reconcile or interpret the tension. Some argue for a continuous unity. The early dialogues are truncated or stylized versions of a later metaphysical project. The Socratic method itself is a means to reveal the conditions under which the forms can be grasped. Others stress a more radical discontinuity. The early works belong to a different literary and philosophical stage, in which the primary aim is to sharpen moral sense and civic virtue, whereas the late works articulate a new metaphysical ontology that must inform how virtue and politics are understood. Still others propose a more nuanced synthesis. The ascent from the moral to the metaphysical is a methodological education, an account of how a rational mind passes from surface appearances to the intelligible reality that interprets them. What does this mean for reading Plato today? First, it counsels caution against a single, easily digestible summary of Plato's philosophy. The early and late texts are not simply opposed, they illuminate different aspects of a consistent impulse, to understand how human beings can know what is truly best and what is the best way to live. Second, it invites readers to appreciate the dialectical energy that moves from the particulars of virtue in dialogue to the universal claims of ontology and epistemology. Third, it reminds us that philosophy, for Plato, is not a museum of doctrines but a living discipline, a continuous conversation about how to render life coherent in the light of reason. 8. Synthesis, the evolution as a disciplined expansion, not a retreat. If we must label the evolution in Plato's logic, a useful formulation is, from Socratic inquiry into virtue as a practical, definitional enterprise to a dialectical ascent into a metaphysical architecture in which the forms provide the objective basis of reality and value. The discrepancies between early and late logic, far from being mere blemishes on the surface of a straight line, marked the slow expansion of a single philosophical project. The early method trains the mind in precise questioning, the mental discipline required to separate opinion from knowledge. The late method trains the mind in rigorous demonstration, the capacity to connect ethical life, political organization, and cosmology within a single, coherent framework. The evolution is therefore not a betrayal of the earlier approach but its elevation. The early insistence on definitional clarity becomes the seed of a more comprehensive approach in which definitions are not abolished but reframed as moments within a larger account of being and value. The early emphasis on the teachability of virtue yields, in the late works, to a doctrine in which virtue is the knowledge of the good, a knowledge that makes possible a political order guided by rational insight. The tension, in this light, is the very energy that pushes the philosophical project forward. It is the test that reveals whether the ascent is possible and, if so, how high it can reach. Conclusion: embracing the evolution as a reader's invitation. Chapter 5: A Portrait of Philosopher. Plato has charted more than a chronology of thought. It has traced a movement from a practical, dialogical method that seeks clear terms and virtuous living to a sovereign metaphysical system that seeks to illuminate the deepest realities underlying existence and value. The discrepancies between the early and later logic do not undermine Plato's achievement, they illuminate its richness. They present a philosopher who is not content with settling for convenient answers but who pushes the boundaries of explanation, who asks how thought can justify not just opinions but the very grounds of reality. The student of Plato who journeys through the Euthyphro, the Meno, and the Theaetetus toward the Republic, the Parmenides, and the Laws encounters a mind that grows, not by discarding its beginnings but by expanding them. The early method remains the stock of a practical wisdom, and the later method remains the stock of a systematic wisdom. Together they offer a portrait of a philosopher who has learned to see virtue not merely as a set of behavioral prescriptions but as a partner to being itself. The evolution, with its discrepancies, is not a fracture in an otherwise continuous life, it is the very arc of a mind learning to reconcile the many particularities of human life with the ultimate unity of reality. For readers, the task is twofold. First, recognize the legitimate differences in scope, aim, and method across the dialogues. Second, appreciate how these differences, when viewed as stages of a single inquiry, enrich our understanding of philosophy's possible paths. Plato's chapter on evolution, with its tensions between early and late logic, becomes not a complaint about inconsistency but a map of intellectual growth, a guide to recognizing how a disciplined mind travels from the art of asking the right questions to the science of answering them in a way that binds ethics, politics, and metaphysics into a single, intelligible whole. In this sense, the evolution is not simply a story about Plato, it is a story about philosophy itself, the life of a mind that refused to rest until the very framework of thought could account for how we ought to live and why the world is the way it is.